Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today's video is a very special one as I have 3 Hmong workplace ghost stories to share with you all today. Before we get started, consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking that join button. Also, remember to leave a like and subscribe so that way you can support my adult beverage addiction. And without further ado, enjoy the show. I worked overnight stocking at a distribution warehouse outside the Twin Cities for a little over a year. I got the job through a temp agency after getting laid off from a factory position, and it turned permanent after about 90 days, which felt like a decent deal at the time since the pay was better than most warehouse jobs in the area, and it came with benefits that I hadn't had in a while. This was a big place. Rows and rows of steel shelving stacked 2 stories high, forklifts running up and down the main aisles all shift, and only about 5 or 6 of us on the floor at any given time between midnight and 6 in the morning. Most nights it was just quiet work. You get your pick list, walk through your section, scan your items, load your cart, and move on. Nothing about the job felt strange to me when I started. It was just tiring, repetitive work, and I was mostly focused on getting through my shift without falling behind on my numbers. Our crew rotated through different sections depending on what orders came in, so it wasn't like any one person was stuck in the same aisle every night. There was a shift lead who handled the schedule, and the rest of us just worked wherever we got assigned, mostly by ourselves since the warehouse was too spread out for people to stick together most of the time. It wasn't unusual to go a full hour without seeing another person, just you in the rows of shelving and the hum of the forklifts somewhere off in another section. The warehouse had motion sensor lights in most of the aisles, the kind that stay off until someone walks underneath them, then click on section by section as you move down the row. It was supposed to save on the electric bill since the place ran 24 hours. I bring this up because that's where the first strange thing happened, in aisle 14, toward the back corner of the building where we kept the slower moving inventory. I was walking toward aisle 14 one night to pull an order, and the lights ahead of me clicked on before I even got close enough to trigger them. I remember thinking that it was odd, but I didn't think much of it. Motion sensors go bad all the time in places like that, especially with how much dust and forklift traffic runs through a warehouse. I got a weird, prickling feeling on the back of my neck walking under those lights, but I chalked it up to being tired, since I was about 4 hours into my shift by that point and running on not much sleep. I figured maintenance would get around to fixing it eventually and kept working. It kept happening though, and only ever in that one aisle. Some nights it wouldn't do anything at all, lights working normal like everywhere else. Other nights I'd be walking up and the lights would already be on by the time I turned the corner, like something had just walked through ahead of me. I mentioned it to my shift lead once, mostly as a joke, and he said he'd put in another ticket for maintenance to look at it, which they apparently already had a few times before I started. About 2 months in, I was pulling a late order by myself in that same aisle when I heard the wheels of a pallet jack rolling somewhere farther down the row, that specific squeaky rattle that they all have. I froze for a second and listened. Nobody was supposed to be back there but me. I called out, asking if someone was down there, and the sound just stopped. I walked the rest of the aisle to check, and there was nothing. No pallet jack, no person, nothing out of place. I told myself that somebody from another section must have wheeled something through and then backed out the other end before I got there, even though that didn't totally make sense given the layout of the building. After that, I started noticing little things every time I worked that aisle. A cold area, right around the same spot the lights always turned on early, noticeably cooler than the rest of the warehouse, even though the whole building ran off the same climate system. Sometimes there'd be a faint smell too, kind of like hot metal or motor oil, similar to what you'd smell near the forklift charging station on the other side of the building, except there was nothing like that anywhere close to aisle 14. I'd also get to a certain shelf in the morning and find a couple of boxes sitting a few inches off from where I'd stacked them the night before, shifted just enough to notice, even though nobody else was assigned to that section overnight. Every time I walked into that aisle after that, I noticed my arms would get goosebumps almost right away, even on nights where the rest of the warehouse felt completely normal. I didn't say much about it at first, mostly because I didn't want people thinking I was losing it or slacking off and blaming it on something weird. But one night, during break, an older Hmong guy named Chu, who'd been working there almost 15 years, asked me straight up if I'd been having trouble in aisle 14. I asked him why'd he asked that, and he said that he noticed I'd been trading sections with people more than usual lately, and that he used to do the same exact thing back when he first started. I asked him what he meant, and he said he used to avoid that aisle himself whenever he could. He had for many years, without really explaining much beyond that. When I pushed a little, he said that he wasn't trying to scare me, just letting me know that I wasn't imagining things, and that plenty of guys before me had noticed the same stuff and just learned to work around it quietly instead of making a fuss. That conversation stuck with me more than I expected it to. A couple of weeks later, I was working with another guy on my crew, younger than me, pretty skeptical about that kind of stuff, the type who'd roll his eyes whenever Chu brought up anything like that on break. We were in different aisles that night, him over in 12, me back in 14 again. Around the same time, maybe a minute apart, we both heard that same pallet jack sound rolling through our sections, slow and steady, like someone had been pushing an empty one down the row. When we met up on the other end of the row to compare notes, he looked genuinely rattled, which wasn't like him at all. Neither of us had been near any equipment, and nobody else on shift was using one either, since we checked with the rest of the crew after over the radio. Our shift supervisor pulled the badge scan logs that day, mostly to humor us, since every aisle has a scanner you badge into when you're working a section for safety reasons. According to the logs, nobody had badged into aisle 14 at all that night except for me, at a completely different time than we both had heard the sound. The camera near the loading dock end of that aisle hadn't caught anything moving either, just an empty row, although the supervisor did point out that the timestamp on the footage jumped a few seconds right around the time when we said we heard the pallet jack, like a small glitch in the recording. He said that it happened sometimes with the older camera system, but had never seen anything like that particularly happen before. Around that same stretch of weeks, I started having a harder time sleeping during the day, even on nights I didn't work that aisle at all. I kept catching myself replaying that sound in my head, the specific rattle of it, whenever things got quiet. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a low-level unease that followed me home and made it harder to fully relax, even off the clock. It was around the same time when I finally asked Chu directly if he knew anything about what had happened back there. He didn't want to get into detail, but he did tell me that years before I started, a worker had been killed in an accident with a forklift in that same exact aisle. He said it wasn't something people talked about much anymore, but the older employees all knew, and most of them tried to stay out of that section when they could. I kept working there for a while after that, telling myself that I could just deal with it, stick to my numbers, and avoid lingering in that aisle any longer than I had to. But it got to where I dreaded getting assigned back there, and I started making excuses to trade sections with other people whenever I could, the same way Chu apparently had for years before me. After a few more months of that, I decided it just wasn't worth it anymore. I put in my 2 weeks and moved on to a different job during the day instead. I never told my new employer why I really left the last one. I just said I wanted a change in schedule, which wasn't exactly a lie. I still think about that aisle sometimes, and I've never had any desire to go back and find out what would happen if I did. I run a small cleaning business for about 8 years now. mostly doing estate cleanouts, which means going into a house after someone has passed away and helping the family clear it out, whether it's for a sale, a move, or just getting the place ready to hand back to a landlord. I got into it almost by accident, helping an aunt clean out her mother-in-law's place one summer, and word just kept spreading from there through family friends until it turned into an actual business with regular clients and referrals from a couple of local realtors. I usually work with 1 or 2 part-time employees, depending on the size of the job. It's steady work, and most of the time it's just long hours of sorting, boxing, and hauling things out, nothing out of the ordinary. The first house that really stuck with me belonged to an elderly man who lived alone. A neighbor had found him after a few days when nobody had seen him bring in his mail. His daughter hired us to clear the place out over the course of about a week, since he'd lived there for a long time and had a lot of belongings. It was just me and one employee on that job. Early on, we cleared out a small back bedroom he'd apparently used as a den, moving an old recliner and a side table out into the garage to be picked up later. The next morning, when we came back, that same chair was sitting back in the den, in almost the exact same spot it had been in before we moved it, facing the same direction. I figured maybe the daughter had come by after us and moved it herself for some reason, so I texted her to ask. She said she hadn't been back to the house at all since we got started. There was also a closet in that same room which we kept having trouble with. Every time we shut it, we'd come back later and find it standing open again, even after I wedged a rolled-up towel underneath the door to keep it shut, which normally works fine for sticky doors like that. There was a cold draft that came from the closet too, which didn't make much sense since there wasn't any vents or windows anywhere near it. My employee mentioned she felt a weird pressure in her ears every time she walked past that closet, almost like her ears needed to pop, and she started finding excuses to work in other rooms whenever she could. Before I'd even started that job, my mom had actually told me, like she usually does whenever I take on a cleanout, that it's good practice to speak to the owners of the house before you could start working on it, so that way you can let whatever might be attached to the place know that you're just there to help clean and not take anything that isn't yours to take. I'd start doing that as a habit on every job by that point, more out of respect than anything else, even on houses where nothing seemed off. On that particular job, though, I noticed a faint smell near the closet too, almost like old pipe tobacco, even though the daughter had already told us that her dad hadn't smoked in years by the time he passed. When the daughter came by at the end of the week to go through some final boxes, I mentioned the chair in the closet to her, just to see if she had any thoughts. She got quiet for a second, and then told me that that closet used to be where her dad kept a small safe with cash and important papers in it, and that he'd always been strange about people going near it, even family. As for the chair, she said that that recliner was where he sat every single evening for as long as she could remember, always facing the same direction toward the window. She thanked me for being careful with his things and said it meant more to her than I probably realized, given everything else she had to deal with that month. Once she said that, I didn't push for any more of an explanation. We finished the job, and everything wrapped up without anything else happening. The second house was a different job, about a year and a half later, on the other side of town. This one belonged to an older woman who had also lived alone and hadn't been found right away. Her son had hired us after coming to town from out of state, and he mentioned up front that his mom had lived in that house for almost 40 years and had a habit of holding on to things. He wanted us to go slow and set anything aside that looked like it might have been sentimental value before hauling the rest to donation. It was more of a deep clean and sort situation, a lot of accumulated belongings over a long life. I brought on a different part-time employee for that one, a younger guy named Marcus who had been with me for a few months at that point and hadn't been on a job like the first house before. A couple of days into the job, Marcus was working downstairs while I was working upstairs, sorting through a bedroom closet. He came up to ask if I had the radio on, since he swore he'd heard someone humming from upstairs somewhere. It was an old, slow tune, almost like a lullaby. I told him that I hadn't been playing anything, and when we checked, every electronic device in the house was already unplugged and boxed up from earlier in the week, including the one radio that we found in the kitchen. He seemed a little shaken, but didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so we kept working. He did mention, a little bit nervously, that he'd gotten chills up his arms while he was listening to it, bad enough that he actually stepped out onto the porch for a minute to shake it off before coming to find me. I didn't think much of it until a couple of days after that, when I was in the living room by myself, boxing up picture frames off the mantel. I heard it too, that same humming, coming from somewhere near the front window, faint but clear enough that I stopped what I was doing to listen. It stopped for a few seconds, the same way Marcus described. I didn't say anything to him about it right away, mostly because I didn't want to freak him out more than he already was. The last thing that happened on that job was small, but it stuck with me. We'd already wrapped and boxed a framed photo off the mantel, one of the women as a younger person standing in front of that same house. The next morning, that photo was sitting upright on the mantel again, unwrapped, like it had never been packed at all. I checked the box myself, and it was empty where that frame should have been. A neighbor stopped by later that week to drop off a spare key for the family, and while she was there, she mentioned that the woman used to sit by that front window most evenings and hum to herself. She said it was practically a running joke on the block since you could sometimes hear her through the screen door in the summer. Neither Marcus nor I had ever met the woman or knew anything about her habits before that. When I told him what the neighbor said, he just nodded slowly and said that at least it made him feel a little better. Like whatever we'd heard wasn't trying to scare us so much as just doing what it had usually done. I still run my business the same way I always have, taking on new cleanout jobs whenever they come in. Marcus still works with me too, and it's just become a normal part of how we start a job now. Most jobs are still completely ordinary. No strange activity, no humming, nothing at all. But every once in a while, a place will feel a little different than the rest, and by now, I've just learned to treat that feeling as part of the work instead of something to be afraid of. I figure if you're going into someone's house after they're gone, the least you could do is be respectful about it, whether or not anything is still there to notice. 8 years in, I've had a lot more ordinary jobs than strange ones, but those two houses are the ones that stuck with me enough to write about, and I doubt I'll ever forget about either of them. I've worked for the same company for about 6 years now, in an office job doing accounting work for a mid-sized firm downtown. Our floor has the usual setup, rows of cubicles, a couple of private offices along the windows, a break room with a printer section, and a bank of elevators right next to the front doors. Most people clear out by 5:30 or 6, but during quarter end, I'd sometimes stay late to finish reports, usually until 8 or 9, sometimes later if things were behind. The cleaning crew usually came through at around 7 o'clock, vacuuming and emptying trash bins, and once they left, the floor would go completely quiet, except for the hum of our ventilation system. I want to say up front that I've never really believed in ghosts or anything like that. I'm the type of person who needs a logical explanation for things, which honestly made a lot of what happened harder to just brush off, because I tried pretty hard to find normal explanations first. The first time I noticed anything was off was during one of those late nights, maybe 8:30 or so. I was the only one left on the floor as far as I could tell. I heard the printer by the break room start up, that low hum it makes when it's warming up to print something. I got up to check, thinking that maybe someone had sent a job remotely, which happens sometimes with people working from home. When I got there, the printer was spitting out blank pages, 4 or 5 of them, nothing on any of them. I figured it was some kind of glitch in the print queue and just canceled the job and went back to my desk. I didn't think much of it at the time. A couple of weeks later, working late again, I packed up around 9 and headed for the elevators. I pressed the button and watched the number above the doors count down, except it was coming from a floor above mine that belongs to a different company entirely, one that locks their suite after hours and isn't accessible without a separate badge. The doors opened and there was nobody inside, just an empty elevator with a noticeably cold draft coming out of it, cold enough that I actually hesitated for a second before stepping in. I told myself that maybe someone from that other company had come down and gotten off on a different floor before I called it, even though the numbers didn't really add up for that to make sense. I got in, rode down to the lobby, and didn't think too hard about it once I was in my car. After that, the late nights started feeling different to me, even before anything else happened. I'd get this feeling like someone was sitting a few cubicles over, even though I knew the floor was empty. A couple times I heard what sounded like typing, that specific clatter of keyboard, coming from the direction of a cubicle that belonged to someone who left hours earlier. I checked once, and the computer monitor was on, glowing in the dark, even though I distinctly remembered watching that same coworker lock her screen and leave before I did. Around that same stretch of time, my desk phone rang late one night, well past the hour anyone from the office would still be calling around. I picked it up, said hello a couple of times, and got nothing but silence on the other end before it clicked off. I checked the caller ID afterward, and it just showed an internal extension, one that used to belong to an office down the hall that had sat empty since a reorganization the year before. I mentioned some of this to my coworker, who sat near me and also sometimes stayed late. She didn't seem surprised. She asked if it ever felt like the temperature dropped right around my desk specifically, and when I told her yes, she nodded like that confirmed something for her. She told me that she also has had her own weird experience as well, and that she'd started leaving before the cleaning crew finished up ever since a strange night of her own a couple of years back that she didn't really get into. The last thing that really got me happened maybe a month after that. I was at my desk finishing a report, and I caught something in the dark window behind my monitor, just a reflection of the office behind me. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing near a reception area, off to the side, not moving. When I turned around, there was nobody there, just the empty rows of cubicles and the exit sign glowing over the stairwell door. My heart was pounding, and I remember my hands were actually shaking a little when I went to shut down my own computer. I didn't stay to finish the report. I packed up and left right then. I brought it up with our night security guard a few days later, mostly just making conversation while he was doing his rounds. He told me that a former employee, years before I started, had passed away from a heart attack late one night in the stairwell, apparently working alone after hours the same way I sometimes did. He said he'd heard a few different people from over the years mention feeling like they weren't alone on that floor after dark, and he didn't seem all that surprised that I was bringing it up. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that another tenant on a different floor had complained about that same elevator stopping on their locked floor a few times over the years. It was the first time I've heard of anything happening to anyone else besides me. For a couple of weeks after that, I had trouble sleeping most nights, waking up around the same time I usually would have still been at the office if I stayed late, my heart already racing before I was fully awake. It faded eventually once I stopped putting myself in that situation, but it took longer than I expected to feel normal again. I still work there. It's a good job, and I wasn't about to quit over something I can't fully explain or prove to anyone else, but I don't stay late by myself anymore. If I have to catch up on some work, I do it from home now, or I make sure somebody else is still around before I agree to close things out at the office. My coworker and I still joke about it sometimes, although not really joking, more like an understanding between us about which nights we were both willing to stick around and which ones were not. That's just how I handle it these days. Dude, that one job where that guy is like working at that warehouse and he's got all these shelves and there's forklifts and you have your own lane and sections, that reminded me of like one job that I worked a long time ago, and I absolutely hated it because they lied to us. They said that there would be like no overtime, and we had overtime. Like you would start at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then you would end at like 8 p.m. at night. It was like literally 12-hour, 13-hour shifts every single day, and there wasn't a single day where I could like, leave early or left on time, to be honest. Gosh, I hated that job. Like, it was one of those jobs where you were packaging things and boxing things up and you had your own little station. Oh, and I was all the way at the end, so people always left all the super heavy stuff or all this annoying things that they didn't want to box. They would just push it at the end. So I had to box all those things, and everybody else got to go home first. But I had all this stuff piled up on me because nobody wanted to pack the hard stuff. Yeah, don't do what I did, guys. Anyways, thank you for coming all the way to the end of the video. Remember to leave a like and subscribe. Consider becoming a YouTube member. We're so close to 10,000 subscribers. I don't even know what I want to do. Let me know what you guys think I should do when we hit 10,000 subscribers. And without further ado, I will see you all in the next one.